Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video where I'm going to be giving you guys some pieces of advice and showing you guys some weird tricks in React that you might not know, but if you don't, I'm gonna explain it to you guys, and it will definitely improve your set of skills and make you a better React developer. So if you're interested in seeing what I'm gonna show you guys, stay tuned and let's get into the video. Okay guys, so the first topic that I really want to talk about is optional chaining. Now this topic, I've seen some videos around, but actually I don't see a lot of beginner developers using it, especially because it is something kind of new, and also because people got too used to solving certain problems by using some outdated methods, and now that optional chaining can help them solve those issues by using this current method, it's kind of hard to convince people to change the way they code. So for that reason, I wanted to show you guys exactly what this is. So before we actually explain how to use optional chaining, I just want to go over really quick on the difference between a null value and an undefined value. I want to go over really quick over here, just talk about the difference between a variable that has a null value and a variable that is undefined. So in JavaScript, you know that you could create a variable over here, for example, the variable name, and set it equal to null, right? So think about it this way. Null is just a variable that has been, you have declared this variable and you have assigned it to have no value. So you have assigned a value to this variable. It's just an empty value. You get what I mean? Undefined is when you declared a variable, but you haven't assigned a value yet. So why am I talking about this? Well, because you might have seen in the past some error messages, or you might have dealt with undefined and null variables. So when you see those variables and you're trying to use them in your application, you might encounter issues, especially when these variables are objects with specific keys and specific properties inside of it. Now, the issue with that is if I came over here and I declared name to be equal to, I won't call it name, I'll call it person. It's just an object called person, and inside of it you have name, which would be something like Pedro, and you have age, which would be something like 21. If you save this and you come over here, you would obviously be able to do something like console log person.name, right? You'll see that in our console, we do get Pedro, right? And I could say console log person.age, and it would say the exact same thing, right? But the issue is when you have an object like this called person, right, or any other name, and you're accessing a specific property inside of it or a key inside of it, you're assuming that this object is not null or undefined, because if it is, then you're trying to access something that doesn't exist inside of a null value. So imagine if person was null, so there wouldn't be a name or an age to access. So the console log would basically just be this, which obviously doesn't make sense. It says the above error occurred. You can't read a property of null, a property of age inside of a null value. So what a lot of people end up dealing with is they have this variable or this data that ends up being null, and they're not handling it correctly because they're just assuming it will always not be null. So they just automatically try to access the variable. So one thing you can do is you could do, for example, an if statement, right? You can say something like if person is not null, like this, or to shorten this, you can just say if person, because if person just means if it's not null, then console log the age. So this won't give us an error, as you can see over here, because it will never go past this condition over here. But if we went back and set this to have a name of Pedro and age of I don't know, 21, and I save this, you'll see now it correctly displays the information. It's passing through this condition. So a lot of people started to use this kind of method of handling when data is null. Now, there is a different way to do this. We don't need to make it into an if statement. JavaScript actually implemented a really cool thing called optional chaining, where instead of having to do it like this, what we can do is we can come over here, instead of having the if statement, we can just put a question mark before the dot. Now, what exactly is this question mark? Well, this question mark is just saying, okay, only access age if this, whatever is behind the question mark, is not null, right? It's pretty simple to understand. So what happens with this is, now if we refresh the page, it will obviously say 21. But if we set this to null, it doesn't matter. It won't give us an error, right? It just says undefined because this turns out to be undefined. It doesn't give us an error. It just defaults to undefined, and we're console logging the undefined value. So you see how optional training can work, right? Now there's two major examples of situations where you would do something like this, and I'll show you guys really quick right now. Okay, everyone. So the first example that I want to show you guys is this one over here. Imagine that you have an application where you are getting data from an API, right? I'm just using a very simple free API that I found, which just lists like US holidays, as you can see over here. And all I'm doing is I'm just getting the data from the API, and I'm just setting a state to have the value that I get back from the data, which is a list of holidays, right? So what I have to do to display the names of each of the holidays is I have to loop through the data variable over here, and then I have to map through each of them and just return the name for each of them. Now the issue is, before the request is done, the data has to be null, right? That's how it usually works. This is how you usually define. So if I don't have this data double ampersand over here, it will break, because for a split second before it makes the request and the request gets the data back, the variable will be null, so it will give us an error and break React. So we do have to have something like this. Now you might argue, oh, why don't you just put this thing over here, right? Like an empty array. Well, this way it will work, because initially we won't have any data, right? So it will just not show anything and then show the thing. Well, the problem with that is that that's not recommended, because you're not accurately describing what initially the data is. If you're making an API request, you should always account for the fact that you might not get back any data. So it might be null. Even if some sort of error occurs or something happens, you should start defining your stuff with null if you're not sure what you're getting back. So in this case, what you would have to do is something like this. However, with optional chaining, you can very simply just remove that and put a question mark over here. So it's not only for accessing objects, it helps with arrays and everything possible. Because you can see over here, now if I save this and I refresh, it still works, because it knows that even though it starts as null, it won't just it will just ignore it until it isn't null anymore. So you can see now we're not getting the error. So the second example I want to show you guys, it's kind of more logical, and it's not really applicable. Like, it's not an example that you would obviously see in real world. However, with what you learn from this, you can use whenever you're having components with props, for example. So for that reason, I came up with this. And basically, as you can see, what I just have is two objects, one called person A, which is a person called Pedro with an age 9. And the second one is a person B with a name and an age, but this person, since they're over 18, they also have this function called drink beer. Now, this can be translated into, for example, a component, because a component might have, for example, optional props, right? You wouldn't want to pass the drink beer prop to person A because they're 9 years old. So that's something you should account for, because when you, for example, create an array with those two people and you're looping through each of them, if you're gonna call the drink beer function, you want to make sure that first the person exists, and then that the function exists inside of the person. And I know it looks kind of weird, but in order to call this function, we have to put the question mark and a dot right next to the name and before the parentheses, because if we don't, this is gonna happen. It will say drink beer is not a function because it isn't in one of the people inside of this array, right? The person A doesn't have it. But since it might occur that someone has it, you'll have to put this, and you'll see that now if I refresh the page, we will get a console log saying beer's nice because one of the people actually said that. So this is kind of the use case for optional chaining. It is really useful. I use it at all the time, especially because I work a lot with data and data is not always consistent. So having this ability is really important, and it will help you a lot debugging in the future. Okay, everyone. So the second trick that I want to show you guys is the idea of using composition instead of inheritance in React. Now, if you've ever read the React official documentation, I wouldn't recommend you doing that because it's really bad. But the thing is, they mention this idea of using composition instead of inheritance. So what I want to show you guys is a clear example where composition would be really useful. And trust me, before I actually understood what composition was, I would never use it. And now I seem to use it consistently because it just helps make the code look a lot better. It stops you from reusing code, like copy and pasting code, when you can just use reusable components, and it helps a lot overall. So this example over here, it's pretty good because I feel like it can be used for a lot of different situations. So what we have over here is we have a project, right? The app component over here, and we have this other component called card. Now a card is just a little box, and it can have a title, a description, or a footer. And we have two over here on the screen. We have card 1 and we have card 2. Now the difference between them is that you can see that card 1 has a title, a description, but there's no like footer. There's no button or anything in the footer. Now card 2, there is a title, a description, and there is a footer. The way that we differentiate each one of them is on our card component, we have our props, and we just show the title if we pass in a title, we show a description if we pass in a description, and at the bottom we say props to a footer, because in case we want to display anything in the footer, we can pass a whole component like this, a whole piece of UI over here, and just make it look however we want. We could add more buttons if we want to as well. We can customize it however we want, right? And this use case is very important because it happens a lot, right? You have a component where it has a lot of properties, but you basically want to show one version of it in a very similar way to another version of it. However, there is a difference, and it is hard to keep passing stuff as props like this. Now, there's other ways of doing this. You could, for example, create a different component, right? You can call this card 1, then call this card 2. I see a lot of people doing this. Then just importing them like this. And one will have a footer and the other won't, right? So instead of grabbing by titles, we could actually just manually put it, right? We could grab this one and just put the title as card 1. Then instead of grabbing props, we'll just put the same description as we put over here inside of here. And now we're not using props. We're just doing them manually. I'll do the exact same thing over here. I'll say card 2, and I'll say the other description over here. Now the thing is, we can manually put this footer directly over here, and we're not passing props anymore. All we're doing is we're just calling the components, and this whole thing over here of us passing the props, it's removed, so it looks fine, right? We still have the same thing, but the difference is now we have two components. Now the thing with these two components is it's also kind of bad because we have two components that are very similar to each other, right? The same things over here, but they just have a minor difference, which is some sort of UI that differentiate them. Now, a way that we can fix this is by using composition. Instead of having card 1 and card 2 or just passing stuff as props, what we can do is we could have some props, right? We could do that for sure. Like we could have the props thing over here. And instead of passing card 2, we could just delete this and just have one component for each of them. Then again, show the title like this, then show the description. And now if we want to add anything else, because those things are stable, right? They exist in both cards. We can pass the title for this one. I'm just going to pass a random title 1, and this will also have a description like this. And this is something that both of them have, right? I'll just copy and paste and do the same thing for both. But basically both of them have this exact same thing. Now, how do we differentiate them? Well, we could actually use composition, which means we're going to, instead of just self-closing the second card, we're going to close it like this, right? And why exactly are we doing this? Because whatever we put inside of this over here will be called the children of this props. So if we want to display it, we could come over here and say something like props.children. And now, if I put some sort of UI over here, like we did before, like the buttons, I'll just put one button for now and say something like click here. You'll see that it still works, right? But we're not passing it as props. We can actually use this to customize as many things as we want. We can do the same thing with card one, right? We can just, instead of self-closing it, we could do it this way. And I'll add an A tag saying go to website. So it's just a link, right? And you'll see now we have this over here. I can put an href, just as an example. I'll just say google.com. And you'll see now they have similar aspects to them, which is these two things over here, but we have a completely different footer, and we're not passing it as props. All we're doing is we're using composition to display the UI that we put over here. Now this pattern is super useful. I use it a lot of times, and I say it's a trick because first of all, a lot of beginners don't know that you could just do this. And even if you know, you might not find yourself using this consistently. You might be too used to doing either one of the two ways I showed you first. However, according to the docs, it is best practice to do this, and the React team found no use case where not using composition would be better. So using composition should be the way to go, and I would recommend it because it will help increase your code quality by a lot. So the last piece of advice I want to give you guys is actually kind of a complicated one, and I will actually make a longer video, a dedicated video just for this topic, because it is something that I really wanted to talk to you guys about. But basically, what I'm talking about is not overusing the context API. Now, some of you, if you've watched previous videos of mine, you might be confused because I always recommend using context API. I always say it's really good. I use it more than I use something like Redux or Recoil. It is a good state management library in my opinion. However, it doesn't mean it doesn't have its negatives, right? The context API basically fails in the sense that it is not that good for high performance. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, imagine in a large application, right? You have many components that might need to have access to the states and values that you pass through your context provider. I came up with this example over here, which obviously isn't a big application, but it just shows you how complicated it can get when you have multiple states that need to be accessed in many different components, right? Over here, I have the app component. I have a child component, which is called instead of the app component. That's why it's called child, because it's a child of the app component. Then we have two grandchild components. I have grandchild 1 and I have grandchild 2. Now, I'm going to show you right now a little diagram to explain how the tree works. It starts with app, then it goes to child, and then it goes to it branches out to both grandchild 1 and grandchild 2. Grandchild 1 and grandchild 2 are just siblings. They're not connected, right? So, but child and the app are connected. So why did I make this example over here? Because I want to explain to you guys what issues Context API brings. So the main problem with it is the fact that although it is easy to use in the sense that it prevents you from prop drilling, and it allows you to access states directly in their specific components. You'll see that in this example over here, we have two grandchild, right? We have grandchild 1 and grandchild 2. Each of them are using different states. The grandchild 2 is just displaying the state called word, which basically it's just a word, and when I click on the increment word button, what it does is it just adds an A to the word that is being displayed. So it basically displays, you can see a word every time I click on the button, right? So it's a state that is constantly changing. And on this one over here, grandchild 1, it doesn't even touch the word state. All it does is it handles a little counter app, right? It has count, which is another state I created over here. So they're unrelated states. And when I click on this, it will increment the count. So they are completely different states existing in completely different components, but both of them are being passed in the context provider. Now, why am I saying this? Because it doesn't matter with the context API. It doesn't matter that grandchild 2 never calls count or never uses the setCount function. it will be re-rendered if the count state changes. So that's an issue. That's a massive issue with the API because the whole, like, we don't want to re-render this component if it doesn't need to, right? It's leading to a lot of unnecessary re-renders. And you can see how this would be horrible at scale because if you have a massive context and with states that are changing consistently, every component that uses that context will also update. So if all of your components, I mean, imagine you have a lot of components, all of them are using the context in some way or another, and the states in the application are constantly changing, even if only one state inside of that context changes, all components will re-render, which is bad. It is really bad for performance at a large scale, and you should understand that even if you're a beginner, you should be worrying a little bit about how to make your project more performant. So that's the issue with the context API. Now, does it mean you shouldn't use it? No, you should use it for sure, depending on what use case you're encountering, right? So I just told you when not to use it. So for example, we know that the issue is that every time a state updates, it renders the whole tree of components, right, that use the context. So when would you use the context API? Well, hear me out. The most simple explanation or the most simple example I can give you is I would use context either in a very small tree of components that you really want to use context API in that case, you don't want to prop drill, then yeah, go ahead, use it. But also in some sort of component tree that have states that are not going to be changing consistently. So what is an example of that? Well, imagine we have this context over here and we have a user, right? And we want to keep track of the username of the user and its ID, right? So those are two pieces of information that won't be changing consistently, right? If a user logs into an application, they should have the same username unless they log out, which doesn't happen consistently. So throughout using the app, that state will be probably not used that much, right? So use that. Use a context for that. Create a context that just displays that state or just uses that state because it is a state that won't be changing that much, meaning you won't be falling into the issue of having a lot of unnecessary re-renders. And just put information that won't change a lot inside of that context. Now, if you have situations where you need, for example, a state that will change consistently, like the count over here because it is changing every time I click on the button, then I would recommend, seriously in this case, using prop drilling, which is something I've criticized in the past, but you gotta understand that there's no exact answer to certain situations. You have to be obsessed with making your project be more performant. So make sure you're analyzing each situation and understanding where the use case is better. So this is kind of like a small rant on context API and prop drilling, but it is a piece of advice that I feel like is missing on a lot of videos on YouTube, and including my previous videos, because I just explain what it is. I never say exactly the issues with it. So for that reason, I wanted to include it in this video. And also, I'll make a more in-depth video where I'm going to show you guys some really good examples on where and when you might want to use one case or the other. So this is basically it for the 3 pieces of advice I wanted to give you guys in this video. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm going to be posting twice a week and I would massively appreciate it. We just hit 70k subs. It's insane. I don't understand what I did to deserve all the support you guys give me, but we're aiming for 100k by the end of the year. That would be, I don't even know, that would be insane. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys supporting my video. And yeah, that's basically it. Really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.